Chapter 13 of The Strange Case of Mortimer Fenley by Louis Tracy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Close Quarters. Human affairs are peculiarly dependent on the weather. It is not easy to lay down a law governing this postulate, which, indeed, may be scoffed at by the superficial reasoner, and the progression from cause to effect is often obscured by contradictory facts. For instance, a fine summer means a good harvest, much travelling, the prolongation of holiday periods, a free circulation of money, and the consequent enhanced prosperity and happiness of millions of men and women. But there are more suicides in June and July than in December and January. On the one hand, fine weather improves humanity's lot. On the other, it depresses the individual. Let the logician explain these curiously divergent issues as he may, there can be no question that the quality of the night which closed a day eventful beyond any other in the annals of Roxton exercised a remarkable influence on the lives of 5 people. It was a perfect night in June. There was no moon. The stars shone dimly through a silent haze. But the sun had set late and would rise early, and his complete disappearance followed so small a chord of the diurnal circle that his light was never wholly absent. A gentle westerly breeze was so zephyr-like that it hardly stirred the leaves of the trees, but it wafted the scent of flowers and meadowland into open windows, and was grateful alike to the just and the unjust. Thus, to romantic minds, it was redolent of romance, and as Sylvia Manning's room faced south, and John Trenholme's faced north, and lay nearly opposite each other, though separated by a rolling mile of park woodland, tillage, and pasture, it is not altogether incredible that these two, gazing out at the same hour, should bridge the void with the eyes of the soul. It was a night, too, that invited to the open. In some favoured lands, where the almanac is an infallible clerk of the weather, fine nights succeed each other with the monotonous regularity of kings in an Amurath dynasty. But the British climate, a slave to no such ordered sequence, scatters or withholds these magic hours almost impartially throughout the seasons, so that June may demand overcoats and umbrellas, and October invite summer raiment. Hence, this superb summer's night found certain folk in Roxton disinclined to forego its enchantments. Trenholme, trying to persuade himself that his brooding gaze rested on the Elizabethan roofs and gables rising above the trees, because of some rare spiritual quality in the atmosphere, suddenly awoke to the fact that the hour was 11. Some men issued from the bar-parlour, and there were sounds of bolts being shot home and keys turned in recognition of the curfew imposed by the licensing laws. Then the artistic temperament arose in revolt. Chafing already against the narrow confines of the best room the White Horse Inn could provide, it burst all bounds when a tired potman attempted unconsciously to lock it in. Grabbing a pipe and tobacco pouch, Trenholme ran downstairs, meeting the potman in the passage. "Get me a key, Bill," he said. "I simply can't endure the notion of bed just yet, so I'm off for a stroll. I don't want to keep anyone waiting up, and I suppose I can have a key of sorts." Now it happened that the proprietor of the inn was absent at a race meeting, and Eliza was in charge. Trenholme's request was passed on to her, and a key was forthcoming. Hatless, pipe in mouth, and hands in pockets, Trenholme sauntered into the village streets. Romance was either a dull jade or growing old and sedate in Roxton. Nearly every house was in darkness, and more than one dog barked because of a passing footstep. About 11:30, Sylvia Manning, sitting in melancholy near her window after an hour of musing, heard a light tap on the door. "Come in," she said, recognizing the reason of this late intrusion. An elderly woman entered. She was an attendant charged with special care of Mrs. Fenley. A trained nurse would have refused to adopt the lenient treatment of the patient enjoined by the late head of the family, so this woman was engaged because she was honest, faithful, rather stupid, and obeyed orders. "She has quieted down now, miss, and is fast asleep," she said in a low tone. "You may feel sure she won't wake before 6 or 7. She never does." The she of this message was Mrs. Fenley. Rural England does not encourage unnecessary courtesy, nor harbour such foreign intruders as Madam. The reiterated pronoun grated on Sylvia. She was disinclined for further talk. "Thank you, Parker," she said. "I am glad to know that. Good night." But Parker had something to say, and this was a favourable opportunity. "She's been awful bad to-day, miss. It can't go on." "That is hardly surprising, taking into account the shock Mrs. Fenley received this morning." "That's what I have in mind, miss. She's changed." "How changed? You need not close the door. Never mind the light. It is hardly dark when the eyes become used to the gloom." Parker drew nearer. Obeying the instincts of her class, she assumed a confidential tone. "Well, miss, you know why I went out?" "Yes," said Sylvia rather curtly. She had left the invalid when the use of a hypodermic syringe became essential if an imminent outburst of hysteria was to be prevented. The girl had no power to interfere, and was too young and inexperienced to make an effective protest, but she was convinced that to encourage a vice was not the best method of treating it. More than once she had spoken of the matter to Mortimer Fenley, but he merely said that he had tried every known means to cure his wife, short of immuring her in an asylum, and had failed. "She is happy in a sort of way," he would add, with a certain softening of voice and manner. "Let her continue so." Thus a minor tragedy was drifting to its close when Fenley himself was so rudely robbed of life. "As a rule, miss," went on the attendant, "she soon settles after a dose, but this time she seemed to pass into a sort of trance. Generally her words are broken-like and wild, and I pays no heed to 'em. But tonight she talked wonderful clear, all about India at first, and a band playin', with sogers munchin' past. Then she spoke about some people called coolies. There was a lot about them in lines and tea gardens, and she seemed to be speaking to another Mrs. Fenley." The woman's voice sank to an awe-stricken whisper, and Sylvia shivered somewhat in sympathy. Another Mrs. Fenley! It was common knowledge in the household that Fenley had married a second time, but the belief was settled that the first wife was dead. Parker, by an unrehearsed dramatic touch, conveyed the notion that the unhappy creature, in a neighbouring room, had been conversing with a ghost. Somewhat shaken and perturbed, Sylvia wished more than ever to be alone, so she brought her informant back to the matter in hand. I don't see that Mrs. Fenley's rambling utterances give rise to any fear of immediate collapse," she said, striving to speak composedly. "No, miss, that isn't all. I was just telling you what happened. There was a lot more. She might have been given the story of her life. But please forgive me, miss, for what I'm going to say. I think someone ought to know. I do really. And you're the only one I dare tell it to." "Oh, what is it?" The cry was wrung from the girl's heart. She had borne a good deal that day, and feared some sinister revelation now. She remembered that poor Mr. Fenley was dead, but didn't appear so greatly upset. She was more puzzled like, kept on muttering, who did it? Who could have the cool darin' to shoot him dead in broad daylight, at his own door, before his servants? She was sort of forcing herself to think, to find out, just as if it was a riddle, and the right answer was on the tip of her tongue. And then, all at once, she gave a queer little laugh. "Why, of course, it was Hilton," she said. Sylvia, relieved and vastly indignant, rose impetuously. "Why do you trouble to bring such nonsense to my ears?" But Parker was stolid and dogged. "I had to tell someone," she vowed, determined to put herself straight with one of her own sex. "I know her ways. If that's in her mind, she'll be shouting it out to every maid who comes near her to-morrow. Really, I thought, miss, it was wise to tell you to-night, because such a thing would soon cause a scandal, and it should be stopped." "Perhaps you are right, and I ought to be obliged to you for being so considerate. But no one would pay heed to my aunt's ravings. Every person in the house knows that the statement is absurd. Mr. Hilton was in his room. I myself saw him go upstairs, after exchanging a few words with his father in the hall, and he came down again instantly when Harris ran to fetch him." "I understand that, miss, and I'm not so silly as to think there's any sense in her blaming Mr. Hilton. But it made my flesh creep to hear all the rest so clear and straightforward, and then that she should say Hilton did it, the black beast. He always hated Bob and me because we were white, and the jungle strain has come out at last. Oh, it was something dreadful to hear her laughing at her cleverness." "Please, please, don't repeat any more of these horrible things," cried the girl, for the strain was becoming unbearable. "I agree with you, miss. They aren't fit to be spoke of, and I say with all due respect that they shouldn't be allowed to leak out. You know what young maid-servants are like. They're bound to chatter. My idea is that another nurse should be engaged to-morrow, a woman old enough to hold her tongue and mind her own business. Then the two of us can take turns at duty, so as to keep them housemaids out of the way altogether." "Yes, I'm sure you're right. I'll speak to Mr. Hilton in the morning. Thank you, Parker. I see now that you meant well, and I'm sorry if I spoke sharply." "I'm not surprised, miss. It was not a pleasant thing to have to say, nor for you to hear, but duty is duty. Good night, miss. I hope you'll sleep well." Sleep! Parker should not have conjured up a new apparition if Sylvia were to seek the solace of untroubled rest. At present, the girl felt that she had never before been so distressfully awake. Splendidly vital in mind and body as she was, she almost yielded now to a morbid horror of her environment. Generations of men and women had lived and died in that ancient house, and to-night dim shapes seemed to throng its chambers and corridors. Physically fearless, She owned to a feminine dread of the unknown. It would be a relief to get away from this abode of grief and mystery. The fantastic dreaming of the unhappy creature, crooning memories of a past life and a lost husband, had unnerved her. She resolved to seek the fresh air and wander through the gardens and park until the fever in her mind had abated. Now, a rule of the house ordained that all doors should be locked and lower windows latched at midnight. A night watchman made certain rounds each hour, pressing a key into indicating clocks at various points to show that he had been alert. Mortimer Fenley had been afraid of fire. There was so much old woodwork in the building that it would burn readily, and a short circuit in the electrical installation was always possible, though every device had been adopted to render it not only improbable but harmless. After midnight, the doorbells and others communicated with a switchboard in the watchman's room, and a burglary alarm, which the man adjusted during his first round, rang there continuously if disturbed. Sylvia, leaving the door of her bedroom ajar, went to the servants' quarters by a back staircase. There she found MacBain, the watchman, eating his supper. "I don't feel as though I could sleep," she explained, "so I am going out into the park for a while. I'll unlatch one of the drawing-room windows and disconnect the alarm, and when I come in I'll tell you." "Very well, miss," said MacBain. "It's a fine night, and you'll take no harm." "I'm not afraid of rabbits, if that is what you mean," she said lightly, for the very sound of the man's voice had dispelled vapours. "Oh, there's more than rabbits in the park tonight, miss. 2 policemen are stationed in the Quarry Wood." "Why?" she said with some surprise. "They don't know themselves, miss. The inspector ordered it. I met them comin' on duty at 10 o'clock. They'll be relieved at 4. They have instructions to allow no one to enter the wood. That's all they know." "If I go there, then, shall I be locked up?" "Not so bad as that, miss," smiled MacBain. "But I'd keep away from it if I was you. Let sleepin' dogs lie is a good motto." "But these are not sleeping dogs. They're wide-awake policemen." "Mebbe, miss. They have a soft job, I'm thinkin'. Of course—" The man checked himself, but Sylvia guessed what was passing in his mind. "You were going to say that the wretch who killed my uncle hid in that wood?" she prompted him. "Yes, miss, I was." "He's not there now. He must have run away while we were too terrified to take any steps to capture him. Who in the world could have wished to kill Mr. Fenley?" "Ah, miss, there's no knowin'. Those you'd least suspect are often the worst." MacBain shook his head over this cryptic remark. He glanced at a clock. It was 5 minutes to 12. "It's rather late, miss," he hinted. Sylvia agreed with him, but she was young enough to be headstrong. "I shan't remain out very long," she said. "I ought to feel tired, but I don't, and I hope the fresh air will make me sleepy." To reach the drawing-room she had to cross the hall. Its parquet floor creaked under her rapid tread. A single lamp among a cluster in the ceiling burned there all night, and she could not help giving one quick look at the oaken settle which stood under the cross gallery. She was glad when the drawing-room door closed behind her. She had no difficulty with the window, but the outer shutters creaked when she opened them. Then she passed on to the first of the Italian terraces, and stood there irresolutely a few minutes, gazing alternately at the sky and the black masses of the trees. At first she was a trifle nervous. The air was so still, the park so solemn in its utter quietude. that the sense of adventure was absent, and the funeral silence that prevailed was almost oppressive. Half inclined to go back, womanlike, she went forward. Then the sweet clinging scent of a rose-bed drew her like a magnet. She descended a flight of steps and gained the second terrace. She thought of Trenholme and the picture, and the impulse to stroll as far as the lake seized her irresistibly. Why not? The grass was short, and the dew would not be heavy. Even if she wetted her feet, what did it matter, as she would undress promptly on returning to her room? Besides, she had never seen the statue on just such a night, though she had often visited it by moonlight. La Rochefoucauld is responsible for the oft-quoted epigram that the woman who hesitates is lost, and Sylvia had certainly hesitated. At any rate, after a brief debate in which the arguments were distinctly one-sided, she resolved that she might as well have an object in view as stroll aimlessly in any other direction. So, gathering her skirts to keep them dry, she set off across the park. She might have been halfway to the lake when a man emerged from the same window of the drawing-room, ran to the terrace steps, stumbled down them so awkwardly that he nearly fell, and swore at his own clumsiness in so doing. He negotiated the next flight more carefully, but quickened his pace again into a run when he reached the open. The girl's figure was hardly visible, but he knew she was there, and the distance between pursued and pursuer soon lessened. Sylvia, wholly unaware of being followed, did not hurry. But she was constitutionally incapable of loitering, and moved over the rustling grass with a swiftness that brought her to the edge of the lake, while the second inmate of the towers abroad that night was yet a couple 100 yards distant. In the dim light, the statue assumed a lifelike semblance that was at once startling and wonderful. Colour flies with the sun, and the white marble did not depend now on tint alone to differentiate it from flesh and blood. Seen thus indistinctly, it might almost be a graceful and nearly nude woman standing there, and some display of will-power on the girl's part was called for before she approached nearer and stifled the first breath of apprehension. Then, delighted by the vague beauty of the scene, with senses soothed by the soft plash of the cascade, she decided to walk around the lake to the spot where Trenholme must have been hidden when he painted that astonishingly vivid picture. Its bold treatment and simplicity of note rendered it an easy subject to carry in the mind's eye, and Sylvia thought it would be rather nice to conjure up the same effect in the prevailing conditions of semi-darkness and mystery. She need not risk tearing her dress among the briars which clung to the hillside. Knowing every inch of the ground, she could follow the shore of the lake until nearly opposite the statue, and then climb a few feet among the bushes at a point where a zigzag path, seldom used and nearly obliterated by undergrowth, led to the clump of cedars. She was still speeding along the farther bank when a man's form loomed in sight in the park, and her heart throbbed tumultuously with a new and real terror. Who could it be? Had someone seen her leaving the house? That was the explanation she hoped for at first, but her breath came in sharp gusts, and her breast heaved when she remembered how one deadly intruder, at least, had broken into that quiet haven during the early hours of the past day. Whoever the oncomer might prove to be, he was losing no time, and he was yet some 20 yards or more away from the statue, itself separated from Sylvia by about the same width of water, when she recognized, with a sigh of relief, that somewhat cumbrous form and grampus-like puffing of Robert Fenley. Evidently he was rather blear-eyed, since he seemed to mistake the white marble Aphrodite for a girl in a black dress. Or perhaps he assumed that Sylvia was there, and thought he would see her any moment. "I say, Sylvia!" he cried. "I say, old girl, what the deuce are you doing in the park at this time of night?" The words were clear enough, but there was a suspicious thickness in the voice. Robert had been drinking, and Sylvia had learned already to abhor and shun a man under the influence of intoxicants more than anything else in the wide world. She did not fear her cousin. For years she had tolerated him, and that day she had come to dislike him actively, but she had not the least intention of entering into an explanation of her actions with him at that hour and under existing conditions. She had recovered from her sudden fright, and was merely annoyed now, and bent her wits to the combined problems of escape and regaining the house unseen. Remembering that her white face and hands might reveal her whereabouts, she turned, bent, and crept up the slope until a bush afforded welcome concealment. Some thorns scratched her ankles, but she gave no heed to such trivial mishaps. A rabbit jumped out from under her feet, and it cost something of an effort to repress a slight scream. But to her credit be it said, she set her lips tightly, and was almost amused by the game of hide-and-seek thus unexpectedly thrust on her. Meanwhile, Robert had reached the little promontory on which the statue was poised, and no Sylvia was in sight. "Sylvia!" he cried again. "Where are you? No use hidin', 'cause I know you're here. Dashed all, if you want a bit of a stroll, why didn't you send for me? You knew I'd come like a shot, what?" He listened and peered, but might as well have been deaf and blind for aught he could distinguish of the girl he sought. Then he laughed, and a peculiar quality in that chuckle of mirth struck a new note of anxiety, even of fear, in Sylvia's labouring heart. "So you won't be good," he guffawed thickly. "Playin' puss in the corner, I s'pose? Very well, I give you fair warnin'. I mean to catch you, and when I do, I'll claim forfeit. I don't mind. Fact is, I like it. It's rather fun, chasin' one's best girl in the dark. Dashed if it isn't better'n a bit of a French farce. Puss, puss! See you, hidin' there among the bushy bushes. Gad, how's that for a test after a big night? Bushy bushes. I must not forget that. Try it on one of the boys. Now come out of it, naughty puss. I'll get you in a tick. See if I don't." He was keeping to the track Sylvia herself had taken, since the lie of the land was familiar to him as to her. Talking to himself, cackling at his own flashes of wit, halting after each few paces to search the immediate neighbourhood and detect any guiding sound, he was now on the same side of the lake as the girl, and coming perilously near. At each step, apparently, he found the growing obscurity more tantalizing. He still continued calling aloud. "Sylvia, Sylvia, I say, chuck it, can't you? You must give in, you know. I'll be grabbin' you in a minute." There were not lacking muttered ejaculations which showed that he was losing his temper. Once he swore so emphatically that she thought he was acknowledging himself beaten, but some glimmering notion that she was crouching almost within reach, and would have the laugh of him in the morning, flogged him into fresh endeavour. Now he was within 10 yards. 8. 5. In another few seconds his hand might touch her, and she quivered at the thought. If concealment could not save her, she must seek refuge in flight, since therein lay a sure means of escape. Not daring to delay, she tried to stand upright, but felt a pull on her dress, as if a hand were detaining her. It was only a briar, insidiously entangled in a fold of her skirt. But she was rather excited now, and there was little to be gained by excess of caution, for any rapid movement must betray her. Stooping, she caught the thorn-laden branch and tore it out of the soft material. Fenley heard the ripping sound instantly. "Ha! There you are, my beauty. Got you this time," he cried, and plunged forward. Sylvia sprang from her hiding-place like a frightened fawn, and valiantly essayed the steep embankment. Therein she erred. She would have succeeded in evading her pursuer had she leaped down to the open strip of the turf close to the water, dodging him before he realized what was happening. As it was, the briars spread 100 cruel claws against her. With each upward step she encountered greater resistance. Desperation only added to her panic, and she struggled frenziedly. The man, unhampered by garments such as clogged each inch of Sylvia's path, pushed on with renewed ardour. He no longer spoke, for his hearing alone could help him now, the girl's black-robed form being utterly merged in the dense shadow cast by brushwood and cedars. He, however, was silhouetted against the luminous grey of the park, and Sylvia, casting a frantic glance over her shoulder, saw him distinctly. In her distress, she fancied she could feel his hot breath on her neck, and when some unusually venomous branch clutched her across the knees and rendered farther movement impossible until her dress was extricated, she wailed aloud in anger and dismay. "How dare you!" she cried, and her voice was tremulous and broken. "I warn you that if you persist in following me, I shall strike you." "Will you, by Jove?" cried Robert, elatedly. "I'd risk more than that, my dear. A kiss for every blow. Only fair, you know, what?" On he came. He was so near that in one active bound he would be upon her. But he advanced warily, with hands outstretched. "Oh, what shall I do?" she sobbed. "Go back, you brute! I hate you! There are policemen in the woods. I'll scream for help." "No need, Miss Manning," said a calm voice, which seemed to come from the circumambient air. "Don't cry out or be alarmed, no matter what happens." A hand, not Robert Fenley's, caught her shoulder in a reassuring grip. A tall figure brushed by, and she heard a curious sound that had a certain smack in it, a hard smack combined with a thudding effect, as if someone had smitten a pillow with a fist. A fist it was, assuredly, and a hard one, but it smote no pillow. With a gurgling cough, Robert Fenley toppled headlong to the edge of the lake, and lay there probably some minutes, for the man who had hit him knew how and where to strike. Sylvia did not scream. She had recognised Trenholme's voice, but she felt absurdly like fainting. Perhaps she swayed slightly, and her rescuer was aware of it, for he gathered her up in his arms as he might carry a scared child, nor did he set her on her feet when they were clear of the trees and in the open park. "You are quite safe now," he said soothingly. "You are greatly upset, of course, and you need a minute or two to pull yourself together, but no one will hurt you while I'm here. When you feel able to speak, you'll tell me where to take you, and I will be your escort." "I can speak now, thank you," said Sylvia with a composure that was somewhat remarkable. "Please put me down." He obeyed, but she imagined he gave her a silent hug before his clasp relaxed. Even then his left hand still rested on her shoulder in a protective way. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Strange Case of Mortimer Fenley by Louis Tracy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Spreading of the Net. That John Trenholme should be in the right place at the right moment, and that the place should happen to be one where his presence was urgently required in Sylvia Manning's behalf, was not such a far-fetched coincidence as it might be deemed, for instance, by a jury. Juries are composed mainly of bald-headed men whose shining pates have been denuded of hairs by years and experience, and these factors dry the heart as surely as they impoverish the scalp. Consequently, juries, in bulk, let it be understood, individual jurors may perhaps retain the emotional equipment of a Chatterton, are sceptical when asked to accept the vagaries of the artistic temperament in extenuation of some so-called irrational action. In the present case, counsel for the defence would plead that his clients, Sylvia would undoubtedly figure in the charge, were moved by an overwhelming impulse shared in common. It was a glorious night, he might urge. Each had been thinking of the other, each elected to stroll forth under the stars. Their sympathies were linked by the strange circumstances which had led to the production of a noteworthy picture. What more likely than that they should visit the scene to which that picture owed its genesis? Trenholme, it might be held, had not knowingly reached that stage of soul-sickness which brings the passionate cry to Valentine's lips, "Except I be by Sylvia in the night, there is no music in the nightingale. Unless I look on Sylvia in the day, there is no day for me to look upon." "But, gentlemen," the wily one would continue, "that indefinable excitation of the nervous system, which is summed up in the one small word, love, must have a beginning. And whether that beginning springs from spore or germ, it is admittedly capable of amazingly rapid growth. The male defendant may not even have been aware of its existence. But subsequent events establish the diagnosis beyond cavil, and I would remind you that the melodious lines I have just quoted could not have been written by our immortal bard Shakespeare if two gentlemen of Verona and two Veronese ladies as well had not yielded to influences not altogether unlike those which governed my clients on this memorable occasion. Juries invariably treat Shakespeare's opinions with profound respect. They know they ought to be well acquainted with his works, but they are not, and hope to conceal their ignorance by accepting the poet's philosophy without reservation. If, however, owing to the forensic skills of an advocate, romance might be held accountable for the wanderings of John and Sylvia, What of Robert? He, at least, was not under its magic spell. He, when the fateful hour struck, was merely drinking himself drowsy. To explain him, witnesses would be needed, and who more credible than a superintendent and detective inspector of the Criminal Investigation Department? When Winter had smoked, and Furneaux had contributed some personal reminiscences, the whole aim and object of which was the perplexing and mystification of that discreet person Tomlinson, the two retired to their room at an early hour. The butler pressed them hospitably to try the house's special blend of Scotch whisky, but they had declined resolutely. Both acknowledged to an unwonted lassitude and sleepiness, symptoms which Hilton Fenley might expect and inquire about. When they were gone, the major domo sat down to review the day's doings. His master's death at the hands of a murderer had shocked and saddened him far more than his manner betrayed. If some fantastic chain of events brought Tomlinson to the scaffold, he would still retain the demeanour of an exemplary butler. But beneath the externals of his office he had a heart and a brain, and his heart grieved for a respected employer, and his brain told him that Scotland Yard was no wiser than he when it came to suspecting a likely person of having committed the crime, let alone arresting the suspect and proving his guilt. Of course, therein Tomlinson was in error. Even butlers of renown have their limitations, and his stopped far short of the peculiar science of felon hunting, in which Winter and Furneaux were geniuses, each in his own line. Assuredly, he would have been vastly astonished could he have seen their movements when the bedroom door closed on them. In fact, his trained ear might have found some new quality in such a commonplace thing as the closing of a door. Every lock and bolt and catch in the towers was in perfect working order, yet the lock of this door failed to click, for the excellent reason that it was jammed by a tiny wedge. Hence it could be opened noiselessly, if need be, and lest a hinge might squeak, each hinge was forthwith drenched with Vaseline. Further, a tiny circlet of India rubber, equipped with a small spike, was placed between door and jamb. Then, murmuring in undertones when they spoke, the detectives unpacked their portmanteaux. Winter produced no article out of the ordinary run, but Furneaux unrolled a knotted contrivance which proved to be a rope ladder. "One or both of us may have to go out by the window," he said. "At any rate, we have Wellington's authority for the military axiom that a good leader always provides a line of retreat." "I wonder what became of the rest of that wine," said Winter, rolling the beer bottle in a shirt and stowing it away. "I didn't dare ask. Tomlinson can put two and two together rather cleverly. He almost interfered when Harris brought the decanter, so I dropped the wine question like a hot potato. It had gone, though, when we came back from Robert's room. Hilton sent for it. Bet you another new hat he emptied." "You'll get no more new hats out of me," growled Furneaux savagely, giving an extra pressure to a pair of sharp hooks which gripped the window-sill, and from which the rope ladder could be dropped to the ground instantly. "Sorry, where did you retrieve that dirty towel?" For the little man had taken from a pocket an object which merited the description, and was placing it in his bag. "It's one of Hilton's. He used it to wipe bark moss off his clothes. Queer thing that such rascals always omit some trivial precaution. He should have burned the towel with the moccasins, but he don't. This towel will help to strangle him. "You're becoming a bloodthirsty detective," mused Winter aloud. "I've seldom seen you so vindictive. Why is it?" "I dislike snakes, and this fellow is a poisonous specimen. If there were no snakes in the world, we should all be so happy." "Blessed if I see that." "I have always suspected that your religious education had been neglected. Read the Bible and Milton, then you'll understand, and incidentally speak and write better English." "Can you suggest any means whereby I can grasp your jokes without being bored to weariness? They're more soporific than bromide. Anyhow, it's time we undressed." Though the blind was drawn, the window was open. There was no knowing who might be watching from the garden, so they went through all the motions of undressing and placed their boots outside the door. Then the light was switched off, the blind raised, and they dressed again rapidly, donning other boots. Each pocketed an automatic pistol and an electric torch, and by preconcerted plan, Winter sat by the window and Furneaux by the door. It was then 11:15, and they hardly looked for any developments until a much later hour. But they neglected no precaution. Unquestionably, it would be difficult for anyone to move about in that part of the house, or cross the gardens, without attracting their attention. Their room was situated on the south front, 2 doors from Sylvia's and 2 from Hilton Fenley's bedroom. The door lay in shadow, beyond the range of the light burning in the hall. Sylvia's room was farther along the corridor. The door of Hilton's bedroom occupied the same plane. The door of his sitting-room faced the end of the corridor. The walls were massive, as in all Tudor houses, and the doors so deeply recessed that there was small space for a small mat in front of each. Ordinary boots placed there were not visible in the line of the corridor, but the detective's footgear stood well in view. There were 2 reasons for this. In the first place, Hilton Fenley might like to see them, so his highly probable, if modest, desire was gratified. Secondly, when Parker visited Sylvia and quitted her, and when Sylvia went downstairs, Furneaux's head, lying between 2 pairs of boots, could scarcely be distinguished, while his scope of vision was only slightly, if at all, diminished. Soon the girl's footsteps could be heard crossing the hall, and the raising of the drawing-room window and opening of the shutters was clearly audible. Winter, whose office had been a sinecure hitherto, now came into the scheme. He saw Sylvia's slight form standing beneath, marked her hesitancy, and watched her slow progress down the terraces and into the park. This nocturnal enterprise on her part was rather perplexing, and he was in 2 minds whether or not to cross the room and consult with Furneaux, when the latter suddenly withdrew his head, closed the door, and hissed, "Snore!" Winter crept to a bed and put up an artistic performance, a duet, musical, regular, not too loud. In a little while his colleague's "Hist!" stopped him, and a slight crack of a finger against a thumb called him to the door, which was open again. Explanation was needless. Hilton Fenley, like the other watchers, hearing the creaking of window and shutters, had looked out from his own darkened room, in all likelihood thanking his stars for the happy chance given thus unexpectedly. He noted the direction the girl was taking, and acted as if prepared for this very development, the truth being, of course, that he was merely adapting his own plans to immediate and more favourable conditions. Coming out into the corridor, he consulted his watch. Then he glanced in the direction of the room which held the two men he had cause to fear, such ample cause as he little dreamed of at that moment. To make assurance doubly sure, he walked that way, not secretly, but boldly, since it was part of his project now to court observation, by others at any rate, if not by the drugged emissaries of Scotland Yard. He waited outside the closed door and heard what he expected to hear, the snoring of two men sound asleep. Returning, he did not re-enter his own room, but crossed the head of the staircase to Robert's. He knocked lightly, and his brother's "Hello there, come in," reached Furneaux's ears. Not a word of the remainder of the colloquy that ensued was lost on either of the detectives. "Sorry to disturb you, Bob," said Hilton, speaking from the doorway, "but I thought you might not be in bed, and I've come to tell you that Sylvia has just gone out by way of the drawing-room and is wandering about the park." "Sylvia? On her lonesome?" was Robert's astounded cry. "Yes. It isn't right. I can't understand her behaviour. I would have followed her myself, but in view of your statement at dinner to-night, I fancied it would save me some annoyance if I entrusted that duty to you." "Look here, Hilton, old chap, are you really in earnest?" "About Sylvia? Yes, I actually saw her. At this moment she is heading for the lake. If you hurry, you'll see her yourself." "I say, it's awfully decent of you. I take back a lot of what I said tonight. Of course, as matters stand, this is my job. Tell McBain not to lock us out." "I'll attend to that, if necessary. But don't mention me to Sylvia. She might resent the notion of being spied on. Say that you two were strolling about. You see, I heard the window being opened and looked out naturally. Anyhow, drop me and run this affair on your own." Robert was slightly obfuscated. The fresh air quickly made him worse, but he was sensible of having grossly misjudged Hilton. "Right-ho," he said, hurrying downstairs. "We'll have a talk in the morning. Dash it, it's 12 o'clock. That silly kid. What's she after, I'd like to know?" Robert gone, Hilton returned to his own room and rang a bell. McBain came, and was asked if he was aware that Miss Sylvia had quitted the house. McBain gave his version of the story, and Fenley remarked that he might leave the window unfastened until he made his rounds at 1 o'clock. Seemingly as an afterthought, Hilton mentioned his brother's open door, and McBain discovered that Mr. Robert was missing also. By that time the detectives, without exchanging a word, had each arrived at the same opinion as to the trend of events. Hilton Fenley was remodelling his projects to suit an unforeseen development. No matter what motive inspired Sylvia Manning's midnight ramble, there could be no disputing the influence which dominated Robert Fenley. He was his brother's cat's paw. When his rifle was found next day, McBain's testimony would be a tremendous addition to the weight of evidence against him, since any unprejudiced judgment must decide that the pursuit of his cousin was a mere pretence to enable him to go out and search for the weapon he had foolishly left in the wood. Hilton might or might not admit that he told Robert of the girl's escapade. If he did admit it, he might be trusted to give the incident the requisite kink to turn the scale against Robert. Surveying the facts with cold impartiality afterwards, Scotland Yard decided that while Hilton could not hope that Robert would be convicted of the murder, the latter would assuredly be suspected of it, perhaps arrested and tried, and in any event his marriage with Sylvia Manning would become a sheer impossibility. Moreover, once the rifle was found by the police, the only reasonable prospect of connecting Hilton himself with the crime would have vanished into thin air. If that weapon were picked up in the quarry wood, or for that matter in any other part of the estate, the hounds of the law were beaten. Winter's level-headed shrewdness and Furneaux's almost uncanny intuition might have saddled Hilton with blood guiltiness, but a wide chasm must be bridged before they could provide the requisite proof of their theory. In fact, thus far, they dared not even hint at bringing a charge against him. To succeed, they had to show that the incredible was credible, that the murderer could be in a room within a few feet of his victim, and in a wood distant fully 400 yards. It was a baffling problem, not wholly incapable of solution by circumstantial evidence, but best left to be elucidated by Hilton Fenley himself. They believed now that he was about to oblige them by supplying that corroborative detail which, in the words of Pooh Bah, lends artistic verisimilitude to an otherwise bald and unconvincing narrative. Winter drew Furneaux into the room and breathed the words into his ear. "You go. You stand less chance of being seen. I'll search his room. If there is a misfire, show a signal after 5 minutes. Right." Furneaux, standing back from the window, but in such a position that a light would be visible to anyone perched on the rock in the wood, pressed the button of an electric torch 3 times rapidly. Then he lowered the rope ladder and clambered down with the nimbleness of a sailor. In all probability, Hilton Fenley was still talking to MacBain and creating the illusion that the last thing he would think of was a stroll out of doors at that late hour. But the little man took no chances. Having surveyed the ground carefully during the day, he was not bothered now with doubts as to the most practicable path. Creeping close to the house till he reached the yew hedge, and then passing through an arch, he remained in the shadow of the hedge till it turned at right angles in front of the Italian garden. From that point to the edge of the quarry wood was not a stone's throw, and clumps of rhododendrons and other flowering shrubs gave shelter in plenty. Arrived at the mouth of the footpath, which he had marked by counting the trees in the avenue, he halted and listened intently. There was no sound of rustling grass or crunched gravel. Hilton was taking matters leisurely. 15 minutes would give him ample time for the business he had in hand. Even if Robert and Sylvia reached home before him, which was unlikely, far more unlikely even than he imagined, he could say that he thought it advisable to follow his brother and help in the search for the girl. The same excuse would serve if he met any of those pestilential police prowling about the grounds. Indeed, he could dispatch the alert and intelligent ones on the trail of the wanderers, especially on Robert's. In a word, matters were going well for Hilton, so well that Furneaux laughed as he turned into the wood. Here the detective had to advance with care. Beneath the trees, the darkness was now so complete that it had that peculiar quality of density which everyday speech likens to a wall. Cats, gamekeepers, poachers, and other creatures of predatory and nocturnal habits can find and follow a definite track under such conditions, but detectives are nearly human, and Furneaux was compelled to use the torch more than once. He ran no risk in doing this. Hilton Fenley could not yet be in a position to catch the gleam of light among the trees. The one thing to avoid was delay, and Furneaux had gained rather than lost time, unless Fenley was running at top speed. After crossing the damp hollow, the Jerseyman had no further difficulty. He breasted the hill and kept a hand extended so as to avoid colliding with a tree trunk. Expecting at any instant to have a bull's-eye lantern flashed in his eyes, which he did not want to happen, he said softly, "Hi, you two. Don't show a light. How near are you?" "Oh, it's you, sir," said a voice. "We thought it would be. We saw the signal, and you said you might be the first to arrive." "Any second signal?" "No, sir." Furneaux recognized the pungent scent of the colza oil used in policemen's lamps. "By gad," he said, "if the average criminal had the nose of the veriest cur dog, he'd smell that oil a mile away. Now, where are you?" "There." He had butted into a constable's solid bulk. "Take me to the rock, quick. We must hide behind it, on the lower side. Is this the place? Right. Squat down, both of you, and make yourselves comfortable, so that you won't feel your position irksome, and move, perhaps at the wrong moment. When you feel me crawling away, follow to the upper foot of the rock, no farther. Stand upright, then, and try to keep your joints from cracking. There must be no creaking of belts or boots. Absolute silence is in order, not a word spoken. No matter what you hear, don't move again until you see the light of my electric torch. Then run to me, turning on your own lamps, and help in arresting anyone I may be holding. Use your handcuffs if necessary, and don't hesitate to grab hard if there's a struggle. Remember, you are to arrest anyone, no matter who it may be. Got that?" "Yes, sir," came two eager voices. "Don't be excited. It will be an easy thing. If we make a mistake, I bear the responsibility. Now keep still as mice when they hear a cat." One of the men giggled. Both constables had met Furneaux in the local police station that afternoon, as he had asked the inspector to parade the pair who would be on duty during that night. It was then that he had arranged a simple code of flash signals, and warned them to look out for Winter or himself during the night. Any other person who turned up was not to be challenged until he reached the higher ground beyond the rock, but that instruction was to be acted on only in the unavoidable absence of one of the Scotland Yard officers. Privately, the constables hoped Furneaux would be their leader. They deemed him a funny little josser, and marvelled greatly at his manner and appearance. Still, they had heard of his reputation. The inspector, in an expansive moment, had observed that Monkey Face was sharper than he looked. Thinking example better than precept, Furneaux did not reprove the giggler. Lying there, screened even in broad daylight by the bulk of the rock and some hazels growing vigorously in that restricted area owing to the absence of foliage overhead, he listened to the voices of the night, never dumb in a large wood. Birds fluttered uneasily on the upper branches of the trees. Indeed, Furneaux was lucky in that the occasional gleam of the torch had not sent a pheasant hurtling off with frantic clamour ere ever the rendezvous was reached. And some winged creature, probably an owl, swept over the rock in stealthy flight. The rabbits were all out in the open, nibbling grass and crops at leisure, but there were other tiny forms rustling among the shrubs and scampering across the soft carpet of fallen leaves. Twitterings and subdued squeaks and sudden rushes of pattering feet, the murmuring of myriad fronds in the placid breeze, the whispering of the neighbouring elms, even the steady chant of the distant cascade, all swelled into a soft and continuous chorus, hardly heard by the county policemen, accustomed as they were to the sounds of woodland at night, but of surprising volume and variety to the man whose forests lay in the paved wilderness of London. Suddenly a twig cracked sharply, and a match was struck. It was of the safety type, and made a little noise, but it was too much for the nerves of a bird, which flew away noisily. Furneaux pursed his lips and wanted to whistle. He realized now what an escape he had had earlier. But the intruder seemed to care less about attracting attention than making rapid progress. He came on swiftly, striking other matches when required, until he stood on the bare ground near the rock. Not daring to lift a head, none of the three watchers could see the newcomer, and in that respect their hiding-place was almost too well chosen. Whoever it was, he needed no more matches to guide his footsteps. They heard him advancing a few paces. Then he halted again. After a marked interval, punctuated by a soft whirring noise, hard to interpret, there were irregular scrapings and the creaking of a branch. Furneaux arose. Keeping a hand on the rock until he was clear of the shrubs, he crept forward on thievish feet. His assistants, moving more clumsily to their allotted station, were audible enough to him, but to a man unconscious of their presence and actively climbing a tree, they were remote and still as Uranus and Saturn. The scraping of feet and heavy breathing, to say nothing of the prompt flight of several birds, led the detective unerringly to the trunk of a lofty chestnut, which he had already fixed on as the cover whence the shot that killed Mortimer Fenley was fired. He was convinced also that the rifle was yet hidden there, and his thin lips parted in a smile now that his theory was about to be justified. He could follow the panting efforts of the climber quite easily. He knew when the weapon was unlashed from the limb to which it was bound, and when the descent was begun. He could measure almost the exact distance of his prey from the ground, and was awaiting the final drop before flashing the torch on his prisoner, when something rapped him smartly on the forehead. It was a rope, doubled and twisted, and subsequent investigation showed that it must have been thrown in a coil over the lowermost branch in order to facilitate the only difficult part of the climb offered by 10 feet of straight bole. The trivial incident changed the whole course of events. Taken by surprise, since he did not know what had struck him, Furneaux pressed the governor of the torch a second too soon, and his eyes, raised instantaneously, met those of Hilton Fenley, who was on the point of letting go the branch and swinging himself down. During a thrilling moment they gazed at each other, the detective cool and seemingly unconcerned, the self-avowed murderer livid with mortal fear. Then Furneaux caught the rope and held it. "I thought you'd go climbing tonight, Fenley," he said. "Let me assist you. Tricky things, ropes. You're at the wrong end of this one." Even Homer nods, but Furneaux had erred 3 times in as many seconds. He had switched on the light prematurely, and his ready banter had warned the parasite that a well-built scheme was crumbling to irretrievable ruin. Moreover, he had underrated the nervous forces of the men thus trapped and outwitted. Fenley knew that when his feet touched the earth he would begin a ghastly pilgrimage to the scaffold. 2 yellow orbs of light were already springing up the slight incline from the rock, betokening the presence of captors in overwhelming number. What was to be done? Nothing, in reason. Yet Furneaux had likened him to a snake, and he displayed now the primal instinct of the snake, to fight when cornered. Thrusting the heavy gun he was carrying straight downward, he delivered a vicious and unerring blow. The stock caught the detective on the crown of the head, and he fell to his knees, dropping the torch, which of course went out as soon as the thumb relaxed its pressure. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Strange Case of Mortimer Fenley by Louis Tracy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Some stage effects. Fenley himself dropped almost simultaneously with the rifle, landing with both feet on Furneaux's back, and thus completing the little man's discomfiture. By that time the 2 policemen were nearly upon him, but he was lithe and fierce as a cobra, and had seized the rifle again before they could close with him. Jabbing the nearer adversary with the muzzle, he smashed a lamp and sent its owner sprawling backward. Then, swinging the weapon, he aimed a murderous blow at the second constable. The man contrived to avoid it to a certain extent, but it glanced off his left arm and caught the side of his head, and he too measured his length. All 3, detective and police, were on their feet promptly, for none was seriously injured, but Furneaux was dazed and had to grope for the torch, and the second constable's lamp had gone out owing to a rush of oil from the cistern. Thus, during some precious seconds, they were in total darkness. Meanwhile, Fenley had escaped. Luck, after deserting him, had come to his rescue in the nick of time. He had blundered into the path and managed to keep to it, and the somewhat strong language in which Furneaux expressed his feelings anent the Hertfordshire constabulary, and the no less lurid comments of 2 angry members of the force, helped to conceal the sounds which would otherwise have indicated the direction taken by the fugitive. At last, having found the torch, Furneaux collected his scattered wits. "Now, don't be scared and run away, you 2," he said sarcastically, producing an automatic pistol. "I'm only going to tell Mr. Winter that we've bungled the job." He fired twice in the air, and 2 vivid spurts of flame rose high among the branches of the chestnut. But the loud reports of the shooting were as nothing compared with the din that followed. Every rook within a mile flew from its eyrie and cawed strenuously. Pheasants clucked and clattered in all directions. Owls hooted, and dogs barked in the kennels, in the stable-yard, and in nearly every house of the 2 neighbouring villages. "I don't see what good that'll do, sir," was the rueful comment of the policeman who had, in his own phrase, collected a thick ear, and was now feeling the spot tenderly. "He hasn't shinned up the tree again, that's a positive certainty." I should have thought that a really clever fellow like you would guess that I wanted to raise a row,' said Furneaux. 'Have you breath enough left to blow your whistles?' 'But, sir, your orders were—' 'Blow and be damned to you! Don't I know the fault is mine? Blow and crack your cheeks. Blow wild peals, my Roberts, else we are copped coppers.' The mild radiance of the torch showed that the detective's face was white with fury, and his eyes gleaming red. To think that a dangling rope's end should have spoiled his finest capture, undone a flawless piece of imaginative reasoning which his own full record had never before equalled. It was humiliating, maddening. No wonder the policemen thought him crazy. But they whistled with a will. Winter heard them, and was stirred to strange activities. Robert Fenley, recovering from an ague and sickness, heard and marvelled at the pandemonium which had broken loose in the park. The household at the Towers was aroused. Heads were craned out of windows. Women screamed, and men dressed hastily. Keepers, estate hands, and stablemen tumbled into their garments and hurried out, armed with guns and cudgels. An unhappy woman, tossing in the fitful dreams of drug-induced sleep, was awakened by the pistol shots and terrified by the noise of slamming doors and hurrying feet. She struggled out of bed and screamed for an attendant, but no one came. She pressed an electric bell, which rang continuously in the night watchman's room, but he had run to the front of the house and was unlocking the front door, where a squad of willing men soon awaited Winter's instructions. For the superintendent, after rushing to the telephone, had shouted an order to McBain before he made off in the direction of the quarry wood. The one tocsin which exercises a dreadful significance in a peaceful and law-abiding English community at the present day struck a new and awful note in Hilton Fenley's brain. Fool that he was! Why had he fought? Why was he flying? Had he brazened it out, the police would not have dared arrest him. His brain was acute as the best of theirs. He could have evolved a theory of the crime as subtle as any detective's, and who so keen-witted as a son eager to avenge a father's murder? But he had thrown away a gambler's chance by a moment of frenzied struggle. He was doomed now. No plausible explanation would serve his need. He was hunted. The pack was after him. The fox had broken cover, and the hounds were in full cry. Whither should he go? He knew not. Still clutching the empty gun, for which he had not even one cartridge in his pockets, he made hopelessly for the open park. Already some glimmer of light showed that he was winning free of these accursed trees, which had stretched forth 1,000 hands to tear his flesh and trip his uncertain feet. That way, at least, lay the world. In the wood he might have circled blindly until captured. Now a drawback of such roaring maelstroms of alarm and uncertainty is their knack of submerging earlier and less dramatic passages in the lives of those whom fate drags into their sweeping currents. Lest, therefore, the strangely contrived meeting between Sylvia and her knight-errant should be neglected by the chronicler, it is well to return to those two young people at the moment when Sylvia was declaring her unimpaired power of standing without support. Trenholme was disposed to take everything for the best in a magic world. Whatever is right, is a doctrine which appealed to the artistic temperament, inasmuch as it blends fatalism and the action of Providence in proportions so admirably adjusted that no philosopher yet born has succeeded in reducing them to a formula. But Eve did not bite the apple in that spirit. It was forbidden. She wanted to know why. Sylvia's first thought was to discover a reasonable reason for Trenholme's presence. Of course, there was one that jumped to the eye, but it was too absurd to suppose that he had come to the tryst in obedience to the foolish vagaries which accounted for her own actions. She blushed to the nape of her neck at the conceit, which called for instant and severe repression, and her voice reflected the passing mood. "I don't wish to underrate the great service you have rendered me," she said coldly, "and I shall always be your debtor for it. But I cannot help asking how you came to be standing under the cedars at this hour of the night." "I wonder," he said. She wriggled her shoulder slightly, as a polite intimation that his hand need not rest there any longer, but he seemed to misinterpret the movement, and drew her an inch or so nearer, whereupon the wriggling ceased. "But that is no answer at all," she murmured, aware of a species of fear of this big, masterful man, a fear rather fascinating in its tremors, like a novice's cringing to the vibration of electricity in a mildly pleasant form, a fear as opposed to her loathing of Robert Fenley as the song of a thrush to the purr of a tiger. "I can tell you in a disconnected sort of way," he said, evidently trying to focus his thoughts on a problem set by the gods, and which, in consequence, was incapable of logical solution by a mere mortal. "It was a fine night. I felt restless. The four walls of a room were prison-like. I strolled out. I was thinking of you. I am here." She trembled a little. Blushing even more deeply than before, she fancied he must be able to feel her skin hot through the silk and linen. For all that, she contrived to laugh. "It sounds convincing, but there is something missing in the argument," she said. "Most likely," he admitted. "A woman analyses emotion far more intimately than a man. Perhaps if you were to tell me why you were drawn to cross the park at midnight, you might supply a clue to my own moon madness." "But there isn't any moon, and I think I ought to be returning to the house." He knew quite well that she had evaded his question, and so readily does the heart respond to the whisperings of hope, he was aware of a sudden tumult in that which doctors call the cardiac region. She, too, had come forth to tell her longings to the stars. That thrice-blessed picture had drawn them together by a force as unseen and irresistible as the law of gravitation. Then he became aware of a dreadful qualm. Had he any right to place on her slim shoulders the weight of an avowal from which he had flinched? He dropped that protecting hand as if it had been struck sharply. "I have annoyed you by my stupid word-fencing," he said contritely. "No, indeed," she said, and, revelling in a new sense of power, her tone grew very gentle. "Why should we seek far-fetched theories for so simple a thing as a stroll out of doors on a night like this? I am not surprised that you, at any rate, should wish to visit the place where that delightful picture sprang into being. It was my excellent good fortune that you happened to be close at hand when I needed help. I must explain that—" "My explanation comes first," he broke in. "I saw you crossing the park. A second time in the course of one day I had to decide whether to remain hidden or make a bolt for it. Again I determined to stand fast. For had you seen and heard a man vanishing among the trees, you would certainly have been alarmed, not only because of the hour, but owing to today's extraordinary events. Moreover, I felt sure you were coming to the lake, and I did not wish to stop you. There was a bit of pure selfishness on my part. I wanted you to come. If ever a man was vouchsafed the realization of an unspoken prayer, I am that man tonight. Trenholme had never before made love to any woman, but lack of experience did not seem to trouble him greatly. Sylvia, however, though very much alive to that element in his words, bethought herself of something else which they implied. "Then you heard what my cousin Robert said?" she commented. "Every syllable. When the chance of an effectual reply offered, I recalled his disjointed remarks collectively." "Did you hit him very hard?" "Just hard enough to stop him from annoying you further to-night." "I suppose he deserved it. He was horrid. But I don't wish you to meet him again just now. He's no coward, and he might attack you." "That would be most unfortunate," he agreed. "So, if you don't mind, we'll take a roundabout way. By skirting the quarry wood, we can reach the avenue near the place where we met this evening. Do you remember?" "Perfectly. I shall be very old before I forget." "But I mean the place where we met. Of course, you could hardly pretend that you had forgotten meeting me." "As soon would the daffodil forget where last it bloomed. Daffodils that come before the swallow dares, and take the winds of March with beauty. Not that I should quote A Winter's Tale, but rather search my poor store for apter lines from A Midsummer Night's Dream. I know a bank whereon the wild thyme blows, where oxlips and the nodding violet grows, quite over-canopied with luxurious woodbine, with sweet musk roses, and with eglantine. There sleeps Titania. Believe me, I have an excellent memory for some things." They walked together in silence a little way, and dreamed, perchance, that they were wandering in Oberon's realm with Hermia and Lysander. Then Sylvia, stealing a shy glance at the tall figure by her side, acknowledged that once she filled the role of Titania in a schoolroom version of the play. "We had no man," she said, "but the masks and costumes served us well. After a day's study I could be a fairy queen once more. I pray thee, gentle mortal, sing again. Mine ear is much enraptured of thy note." She stopped suddenly. The next lines were distinctly amorous. He laughed, with ready appreciation of her difficulty, but generously provided a way out. "Poor mortal," he tittered, "and must I wear an ass's head to be in character?" A loud report, and then another, brought them back rudely from a make-believe wood near Athens to a peril-haunted park in an English county. For the second time that night, Sylvia knew what fear meant. Intuitively, she shrank close to the strong man who seemed destined to be her protector, and when an arm clasped her again, she cowered close to its sheltering embrace. "Oh, what is it?" she wailed in terror. "It is hard to say," he answered quietly, and the confidence in his voice was the best assurance of safety he could have given. "Those shots were fired from some sort of rifle, not of the same calibre as that which was used this morning, but unquestionably a rifle. Perhaps it is one of those modern pistols. I don't wish to alarm you needlessly, Miss Manning, but there is some probability that the police have discovered the man who killed Mr. Fenley, and there is a struggle going on. At any rate, let us remain out here in the open. We shall be as safe here as anywhere.' Sylvia, who had not been afraid to venture alone into the park at midnight, was now in a quite feminine state of fright. She clung to Trenholme without any pretence of other feeling than one of unbounded trust. Her heart was pounding frantically, and she was trembling from head to foot. The police whistles were shrilling their insistent summons for help, and Trenholme knew that the commotion had arisen in the exact part of the quarry wood whence the murderous bullet that morning. He was unarmed, of course, being devoid of even such a mildly aggressive weapon as a walking-stick, but there was no doubt in his mind that the best thing to do was to stand fast. He was not blind to the possibility of imminent danger, for the very spot they had reached lay in a likely line of retreat for any desperado whom the police might have discovered and be pursuing. Naturally, he took it for granted that the criminal had fired the 2 shots, and the fact that whistles were still in full blast showed that the chase had not been abandoned. Still, the only course was to take such chances as came their way. He could always shield the girl with his own body, or tell her to lie flat on the ground while he closed with an assailant, if opportunity served. Being a level-headed, plucky youngster, he was by no means desirous of indulging in deeds of derring-do. The one paramount consideration was the safe conduct of Sylvia to the house, and he hoped sincerely that if a miscreant were trying to escape, he would choose any route save that which led from the wood to Roxton village. "Don't hesitate if I bid you throw yourself down at full length," he said, unconsciously stroking Sylvia's hair with his free hand. "In a minute or two we'll make for the avenue. Meanwhile, let us listen. If any one is coming in this direction, we ought to hear him, and forewarned is forearmed." Choking back a broken question, she strove submissively to check her distressed sobbing. Were it not for the hubbub of thousands of rooks and pheasants, they would assuredly have caught the sounds of Hilton Fenley's panic-stricken onrush through the trees. As it was, he saw them first, and even in his rabid frenzy recognized Sylvia. It was only to be expected that he should mistake Trenholme for his brother, and in a new spasm of fright he recollected he was carrying the rifle. Robert Fenley, of course, would identify it at a glance, and could hardly fail to be more than suspicious at sight of it. With an oath, he threw the tell-tale weapon back among the undergrowth, and, summoning the last shreds of his shattered nerves to lend some degree of self-control, walked rapidly out into the open park. Sylvia saw him and shrieked. Trenholme was about to thrust her behind him, when some familiar attribute about the outline of the approaching figure caused her to cry, "Why, it's Hilton!" "Yes, Sylvia," came the breathless answer. "You heard the firing, of course. The police have found some fellow in the wood. You and Bob make for the avenue. I'm going this way in case he breaks cover for the Roxton gate. Hurry! You'll find some of the men there. Never mind about me. I'll be all right." He was running while he talked, edging away toward the group of cedars, and under the conditions it was not for Trenholme to undeceive him as to the mistake in regard to the artist as Robert Fenley. In any event, the appearance of Hilton from that part of the wood seemed to prove that the man whom the law was seeking could not be in the same locality, so Trenholme did not hesitate to urge Sylvia to fall in with her cousin's instructions. For the time, then, they may be left to progress uninterruptedly to safety and not very prompt enlightenment. The flight of the self-confessed murderer calls for more immediate attention. Probably, after the first moment of suspense, and when he was sure that escape was still not utterly impracticable, he intended to cross the park to the northwest and climb the boundary wall. But a glimpse of the black line of trees daunted him. He simply dared not face those pitiless sentinels again. He pictured himself forcing a way through the undergrowth in the dense gloom, and failing, perhaps, for the vegetation was wilder there than in any other portion of the estate. So, making a detour, he headed for the unencumbered parkland once more, and gained the wall near Jackson's farm about the time that Trenholme and Sylvia entered the avenue. He was unquestionably in a parlous state. Bareheaded, unarmed, he could not fail to attract attention in a district where every resident knew the other, nor could he resist capture when the hue and cry went forth. What to do he knew not. Even if he managed to reach the railway station unchallenged, the last train of the day had left for London soon after 11, and the earliest next morning was timed for 5 o'clock, too late by many hours to serve his desperate need. Could he hire a motor car or bicycle? The effort was fraught with every variety of risk. There was a small garage at Easton, but those cunning detectives would be razing the countryside already, and the telephone would close every outlet. For the first time in his life, Hilton Fenley realized that the world is too small to hold a murderer. He was free, would soon have the choice of a network of main roads and lanes in a rural district at the dead hour of the night. Yet he felt himself securely caged as some creature of the jungle trapped in a pit. Crossing Jackson's farmyard, not without disturbing a dog just quieting down after the preceding racket, he hurried into the village street, having made up his mind to face the inevitable and arouse the garage-keeper. By the irony of fate, he passed the cottage in which Police Constable Farrow was lying asleep, and utterly unaware of the prevalent excitement, to join in which he would have kept awake all that night and the next. Then the turn of fortune's wheel befriended Fenley again. Outside a house stood Dr. Stern's car, a closed-in runabout in which both the doctor and his chauffeur were sheltered from inclement weather. The chauffeur was lounging on the pavement, smoking a cigarette, and Fenley, of course, recognized him. His heart leaped. Let him be bold now, and he might win through. A handkerchief wiped some of the blood off his face where the skin had been broken by the trees, and he avoided the glare of the lamps. "Hello, Tom," he said. "Where is the doctor?" "Inside, sir," with a glance toward an upper room where a light shone. "What's happened at the Towers, sir? Was it shooting I heard a while since?" "Yes. A false alarm, though. The police thought they had found some suspicious character in the grounds." "By jing, sir, did they fire at him?" Fenley saw that the story was weak, and hastened to correct it. No, he said. "The police didn't shoot first. That was my brother Robert. You know what a harebrained fellow he is. Said he fired in order to make the man double back, but that is a small matter. Can I have one word with Dr. Stern?" "I'll see, sir." And the chauffeur went to the house. Furneaux had estimated Hilton Fenley correctly in ascribing to him the quality of cold-bloodedness. 99 men among 100 would have appropriated the motor car then and there, but Fenley saw, by waiting a minute and displaying the requisite coolness, he might succeed in throwing his pursuers off the trail for some hours. Sterne came. It chanced that he was watching a good patient through a crisis, and would be detained until daybreak. "Hello, Hilton," he cried. "What's up now? And what's the racket in the park?" Fenley explained, but hurried to the vital matter. "My car is out of action," he said. "I was going to the Easton garage to hire one when I saw yours standing here. Lend it to me for a couple of hours, there's a good fellow. I'll pay well for the use of it." "Pay? Nonsense! Jump in. Take Mr. Fenley where he wants to go, Tom. Where to first, Hilton?" "St. Albans. I'm exceedingly obliged. And look here, Sterne, I insist on paying." "We can settle that afterwards. Off with you. I'll walk home, Tom." Away sped the car. Running through Easton, Fenley saw 2 policemen stationed at a crossroad. They signalled the car to stop, and his blood curdled. But in the same instant they saw the chauffeur's face. The other occupant was cowering as far back in the shadow as possible. "Oh, it's Dr. Sterne," said one. "Right, Tom. By the way, have you seen anything of—" "Go on, do," growled Fenley, drowning the man's voice. "I'm in a vile hurry." That was his last real hairbreadth escape, for that night at any rate, though other thrills were in store. The chauffeur was greatly surprised when bidden to go on from St. Albans to London and take the High Barnet Road to the City. But Fenley produced a £5 note at the right moment, and the man reflected that his master would not hesitate to oblige a wealthy client who evidently meant to make good the wear and tear on the car. In about an hour Fenley alighted on the pavement opposite the firm's premises in Bishopsgate Street. If a policeman had chanced to be standing there, the fugitive would have known that the game was up. But the only wayfarers in that part of the thoroughfare were some street cleaners. Now that he saw a glimmer of light where hitherto all was darkness, he was absolutely clear-brained and cool in manner. "Wait 5 minutes," he said. "I shan't detain you longer." He let himself in with a master key, taken from his dead father's pockets earlier by Tomlinson. Going to the banker's private office, he ransacked a safe and a cabinet with hasty method. He secured a hat, an overcoat, an umbrella, and a packed suitcase, left there for emergency journeys in connection with the business, and was back in the street again within less than the specified time. His tongue clave to the roof of his mouth when he found a policeman chatting with the chauffeur, but the man saluted him with a civil "Good morning." In the city of London, which is deserted as a cemetery from 10 o'clock at night till 6 in the morning, the police keep a sharp eye on waiting cabs and automobiles between these hours, and invariably inquire their business. The constable was quite satisfied that all was well when he saw Mr. Hilton Fenley, whom he knew by sight. In any event, the flying murderer was safer than he dared hope in that place and at that time. The Roxton telephonic system was temporarily useless in so far as it affected his movements, for a fire had broken out at the towers, and the flames of the burning roof had been as a beacon for miles around during the whole of the time consumed by the run to London. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Strange Case of Mortimer Fenley by Louis Tracy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The close of a tragedy. Winter was in the quarry wood, and feeling his way, but trusting to hands and feet, when he heard and soon saw Furneaux and the two constables coming toward him. The little detective held the electric torch above his head, and was striding on without looking to right or left. The bitterness of defeat was in his face. Life had turned to gall and wormwood. As the expressive American phrase has it, he was chewing mud. The superintendent smiled. He knew what torment his friend was suffering. "Hello there," he said gruffly, and the three men jumped, for their nerves were on edge. "Oh, it's you, Napoleon?" yelped Furneaux. "Behold Soothe and his army corps, come to explain how Sir John Moore dodged him at Corunna." "You've lost your man, then?" "Botched the job at the moment of victory, and all through a rope end." "Tush, that isn't in your line." "Must I be lashed by your wit, too? The rope was applied to me, not to Fenley." "You don't mean to say, sir," broke in one of the astounded policemen, "that you think Mr. Hilton killed his own father?" "Was it you who got that punch in the tummy?" "Yes, sir." "Well, save your breath. You'll want it when the muscles stiffen. Crénom de pipe, to think that I, Furneaux of the Yard, should queer the finest pinch I ever stood on." "Oh, come now, Charles," said Winter. "Don't cry over spilt milk. You'll catch Fenley all right before the weather changes. What really happened?" Aware of the paramount necessity of suppressing his personal woes, Furneaux at once gave a graphic and succinct account of Fenley's imminent capture and escape. He was scrupulously fair, and exonerated his assistants from any share of the blame, if indeed any one could be held accountable for the singular accident which precipitated matters by a few vital seconds. Had Fenley reached the ground before the torch revealed the detective's presence, the latter would have closed with him instantly, throwing the torch aside, and thus taking the prisoner at the disadvantage which the fortune of war had brought to bear against the law. Furneaux was wiry, though slight, and he could certainly have held his man until reinforcements came, nor would the constable's lamps have been extinguished during the mêlée. "Then he has vanished, rifle and all," said Winter, when Furneaux had made an end. "As though the earth had swallowed him. 1,000 years ago it would have done so," was the humiliated confession. "None of you have any notion which direction he took?" "I received such a whack on the skull that I believe he disappeared in fire," said Furneaux. "My friend here," turning to the policeman who had voiced his amazement at the suggestion that Hilton Fenley was the murderer, "was in the position of Bret Harte's Negro lecturer on geology. Well, this other stalwart thought he had been kicked by a horse. We soon recovered, but had to grope for each other. Then I called the heavens to witness that I was dished." "That gave us a chance of salvage, anyhow," said Winter. "I phoned the Roxton inspector, and he will block the roads. When he has communicated with St. Albans and some other centres, we should have a fairly wide net spread. Bates is coming from the lodge to take charge of a search party to scour the woods. We want that rifle. He must have dropped it somewhere. He'll make for a station in the early morning. He daren't tramp the country without a hat and in a black suit." Winter was trying to put heart into his colleague, but Furneaux was not to be comforted. The truth was that the blow on the head had been a very severe one. Unfortunately, he had changed his hard straw hat for a soft cap, which gave hardly any protection. Had Fenley's perch been a few inches lower when he delivered that vindictive thrust, Scotland Yard would probably have lost one of its most zealous officers. So the Jerseyman said nothing, having nothing to say that was fit for the ears of the local constabulary, and Winter suggested that they should return to the mansion and give Bates instructions. Then he, Winter, would telephone headquarters, have the main roads watched, and the early Continental trains kept under surveillance. Furneaux, torch in hand, at once led the way. Thus the party was visible before it entered the avenue, and two young people who had bridged months of ordinary acquaintance in one moment of tragedy, being then on the roadway, saw the gleam of light and waited. "Good," cackled the little detective when his glance fell on them. "I'm glad to see there's one live man in the bunch. I presume you've disposed of Mr. Robert Fenley, Mr. Trenholme?" "Yes," said the artist. "His affairs seem to be common property. His brother evidently knew he was out of doors, and now you—" Furneaux woke up at that. "His brother? How can you know what his brother knew?" "Mr. Hilton Fenley saw Miss Manning and myself, and mistook me for—" "Saw you? When?" "About 5 minutes ago, on the other side of the wood." "What did he say? Quick!" "He told us that the shooting was the outcome of your efforts to catch some man hiding among the trees." "Of my efforts?" "He didn't mention you by name. The words he used were the police. He was taking part in the chase, I suppose." "Which way did he go?" Trenholme hesitated. Not only was he not quite conversant with the locality, but his shrewd wits had reached a certain conclusion, and he did not wish to be too outspoken before Sylvia. Surely she had borne sufficient for one day. Thereupon the girl herself broke in. "Hilton went toward the Cedars. He may be making for the eastern gate. Have you caught any man?" "Not yet, Miss Manning," said Winter, assuming control of the situation with a firm hand. "I advise you to go straight to your room, and not stir out again tonight. There will be no more disturbances, I promise you that." Even the chief of the C.I.D. can err when he prophesies. At that instant the two lines of trees lost their impenetrable blackness. Their foliage sprang into red-tinted life, as if the witches of the Brocken had chosen a new meeting-place, and a crackling, tearing sound rent the air. "Oh!" screamed Sylvia, who chanced to be facing the mansion. "The house is on fire!" They were standing in a group, almost where Police Constable Farrow had stood at 10 minutes past 10 the previous morning. Hence they were aware of this addition to the day's horrors before the house servants, who, headed by Tomlinson, were gathered on and near the flight of steps at the entrance. Every female servant in the establishment was there as well, not outside the door, but quaking in the hall. MacBain was the first among the men to realize what was happening. He caught the loud clang of an automatic fire alarm ringing in his room, and at once called the house fire brigade to run out the hose, while he dashed upstairs into the north corridor, from which a volume of smoke was pouring. "Good heavens!" he cried, on reaching the cross gallery. "It's in Mr. Fenley's rooms." Mr. Fenley's rooms! No need to tell the horrified staff which rooms he meant. A fire was raging in the private suite of the dead man. The residence was singularly well equipped with fire-extinguishing appliances. Mortimer Fenley had seen to that. Hand grenades, producing carbonic acid gas, generated by mixing water with acid and alkali, were stored in convenient places, and there was a plentiful supply of water from many hose pipes. The north and south galleries looked on to an internal courtyard, so there was every chance of isolating the outbreak, if it were tackled vigorously, and no fault could be found with either the spirit or training of the amateur brigade. Consequently, only 2 rooms, a bedroom and adjoining dressing-room, were well alight. These were burned out completely. A sitting-room on one side was badly scorched, as was a spare room on the other, but the men soon knew that they had checked the further progress of the flames, and were speculating, while they worked, as to the cause of a fire originating in a set of empty apartments, when Parker, Mrs. Fenley's personal attendant, came sobbing and distraught to Sylvia. "Oh, miss," she cried, "oh, miss, where is your aunt?" "Isn't Mrs. Fenley in her room?" asked the girl, yielding to a sense of neglect in not having gone to see if Mrs. Fenley was alarmed, though the older woman was not in the slightest danger. The 2 main sections of the building were separated by an open space of 40 feet, and the towers had exceedingly thick walls. "No, miss, I can't find her anywhere," said the woman, well aware that if anyone was at fault, it was herself. "You know, when I saw you, I went back then, and she was sleeping, so I thought I could leave her safely. No, miss, what has become of her? Maybe she was aroused by the shooting." All hands that could be spared from the firefighting operations engaged instantly in an active search, but there was no clue to Mrs. Fenley's disappearance beyond an open door and a missing night-light. The electric current was shut off at the main at midnight, except on a special circuit communicating with the hall, the courtyard, and McBain's den, where he had control of these things. High and low they hunted without avail, until McBain himself stumbled over a calcinated body in the murdered banker's bedroom. The poor creature had waked to some sense of disaster. Vague memories of the morning's horror had led her, night-light in hand, to the spot where she fancied she would find the one person on earth in whom she placed confidence. For Mortimer Fenley had always treated her with kindness, even if his methods were not in accord with the commonly accepted moral code. Presumably, on discovering that the rooms were empty, some further glimmering knowledge had stirred her benumbed consciousness. She may have flung herself on the bed in a paroxysm of weeping, heedless of the overturned night-light and the havoc it caused. That, of course, is sheer guesswork, though the glass dish which held the light was found later on the charred wood, which was protected to some extent by a thick carpet. At any rate, she had not long survived the husband who had given her a pomp and circumstance for which she was ill-fitted. They were buried in the same grave, and Hertfordshire sent its thousands to the funeral. Soon after her fate became known, Winter wanted Furneaux, but his colleague was not in the house. The telephone having broken down, owing to the collapse of a standard, and the necessity of subduing the fire having put a stop to any immediate search being made in the park, Winter thought that the pair of them would be better employed if they transferred their energies to the local police station. He found Furneaux seated on the lowermost step at the entrance. The Jerseyman was crying as if his heart would break, and Trenholme was trying to comfort him, but in vain. "What's up now?" inquired the superintendent, thinking at the moment that his friend and comrade was giving way to hysteria indirectly owing to the blow he had received. Furneaux looked up. It was the darkest hour of the night, and his chief could not see the distraught features wrung with pain. "James," he said, mastering his voice by a fierce effort, "my mad antics killed that unfortunate woman. She was aroused by the shots. She would cry for help, and none came. Heavens, I can hear her now. Then she ran for refuge to the man who had been everything to her since she was a barrack-room kid in India. I'm done, old fellow. I resign. I can never show my face in the yard again." "It'll do you a world of good if you talk," said Winter, meaning to console, but unconsciously wounding by cruel sarcasm. "I'll be dumb enough after this night's work," said Furneaux, in a tone of such utter dejection that Winter began to take him seriously. "If you fail me now, Charles," he said, and his utterance was thick with anger at the crassness of things, "I'll consider the advisability of sending in my own papers. Dash it." He said something quite different, but his friends may read this record, and they would repudiate an exact version with scorn and disbelief. "Are we going to admit ourselves beaten by a half-bred hound like Hilton Fenley? Not if I know it, or I know you. We've got the noose round his neck, and you and I will pull it tight if we have to follow him to—" "Pardon the interruption, gentlemen," said a voice. "I was called out of bed to come to the fire, took a short cut across the park. Blow me if I didn't kick my foot against this." And Police Constable Farrow, who had approached unnoticed, held out an object which seemed to be a rifle. Owing to his being seated, Furneaux's eyes were on a level with it, and he could see more clearly than the others. He struck a match. Then there could be no doubt that the policeman had actually picked up the weapon which had set in motion so many and such varied vicissitudes. But Farrow had more to say. It had been his happy lot, during many hours, to figure bravely in the Fenley case, and he carried himself as a valiant man and true to the end. "I think I heard you mention Mr. Hilton," he went on. "I met Dr. Stern in the village, and he told me Mr. Hilton had borrowed his car." Furneaux stood up. "Continue, Solomon," he said, and Winter sighed with relief. The little man was himself again. "That's all, gentlemen, or practically all. It struck me as unusual, but Dr. Stern said Mr. Hilton's motor was out of gear, and he wanted a car in a desperate hurry." "He did indeed," growled Furneaux. "You're quite sure there's no mistake?" "Mistake, sir? How could there be? The doctor was walking home. That's an unusual thing. He never walks a yard if he can help it. Mr. Hilton borrowed the car to go to St. Albans." "Did he indeed? Just how did he come to find the car waiting for him?" "Oh, that's the queer part of it. Dr. Stern is looking after poor old Joe Bland, who's mighty bad with— there now, if I haven't gone and forgotten the name, something itis. And Mr. Hilton must have seen the car standing outside Bland's house. But what was he doing in Roxton at 12:30? That's what beats me. And then just fancy me stubbing my toe against this." Again he displayed the rifle, as if it were an exhibit, and he were giving evidence. "Let's go inside and get a light," said Winter, and the four mounted the steps into the hall. Robert Fenley was there, red-faced as ever, for he had helped in putting out the fire, but quite sober, since he had been very sick. Some lamps and candles gave a fair amount of light, and Robert eyed Trenholme viciously. "So it was you," he said. "I thought it was. Well, my father and mother are both dead, and this is no time for settling matters, but I'll look you up when this business is all over." "If you do that, you'll get hurt," said Winter brusquely. "Is that your rifle?" And he pointed to the weapon in Furneaux's hands. "Yes. Where was it found?" "In the quarry wood, sir, but almost in the park," said the policeman. "Has it been used recently?" Fenley could hardly have put a question better calculated to prove his own innocence of any complicity in the crime. Winter took the gun, meaning to open the breech, but he and Furneaux simultaneously noticed a bit of black thread tied to one of the triggers. It had been broken, and the two loose ends were some inches in length. "That settles it," murmured Furneaux. "The scoundrel fixed it to a thick branch, aimed it carefully on more than one occasion. Look at the sights, set for 400 yards, and fired it by pulling a cord from his bedroom window, when he saw his father occupying the exact position where the sighting practiced on Monday and Tuesday showed that a fatal wound would be inflicted. The remaining length of cord was stronger than this packing thread, which was bound to give way first when force was applied. Well, that side of the question didn't bother us much, did it, Winter?" "May I ask what you're talking about?" inquired Robert Fenley hoarsely. "About that precious rogue, your half-brother," was the answer. "That is why he went to his bedroom, one window of which looks out on the park and the other on the east front, where he watched his father standing to light a cigar before entering the motor. He laid the cord before breakfast, knowing that Miss Manning's habit of bathing in the lake would keep gardeners and others from that part of the grounds. When the shot was fired, he pulled in the cord—" "I saw him doing that," interrupted Trenholme, who, after one glance at the signs of his handiwork on Robert Fenley's left jaw, had devoted his attention to the extraordinary story revealed by the detectives. "You saw him?" And Furneaux wheeled round in sudden wrath. "Why the deuce didn't you tell me that?" "You never asked me." "How could I ask such a thing? Am I a necromancer, a wizard, or a thought-reader?" Trenholme favoured the vexed little man with a contemplative look. "I think you are all those, and a jolly clever art critic as well." Furneaux was discomfited, and Winter nearly laughed, but the matter at issue was too important to be treated with levity. "Tell us now what you saw, Mr. Trenholme," he said. "When the shot was fired, I recognized it as coming from a high-velocity rifle," said the artist. "I was surprised that such a weapon should be used in an enclosed park of this nature, and looked toward the house to discover whether or not any heed would be given to the incident there. From where I was seated, I could see the whole of the south front, but not the east side, where the brass fittings of the automobile alone were visible, glinting through and slightly above a yew hedge. Now, when Miss Manning returned to the house and entered by way of a window on the ground floor, I noticed that no other window was open. But after the report of the gun, I saw the end window of the first floor on the southeast side slightly raised, say 6 inches, and someone in the room was, as I regarded it, gesticulating or making signs. That continued nearly half a minute and then ceased. I don't know whether the person behind the glass was a man or woman, but someone was there, and engaged in the way I've described. If your theory is correct, the motions would be precisely those you suggest, similar to those of a fisherman reeling in a line. Your simile happens to be exact, said Winter, while Hilton Fenley and my friend here were having a dust-up in the quarry wood. I searched his rooms, and among other things I came upon a salmon reel carrying an exceptional quantity of line. So our case is fairly complete. I'm sorry to have to inform you, Mr. Fenley, that not only did your half-brother kill your father, but he tried his level best to put the crime on your shoulders. He overreached himself in sending for Scotland Yard men. We have seen too much of the seamy side of life to accept as gospel truth the first story we hear. The very fact that Hilton Fenley was attacking you in your absence prejudiced us against him at the outset. There were other matters, which I need not go into now, which converted our dislike into active suspicion. But it is only fair that you should understand how narrow was your escape from arrest. Had the local police been in sole charge, I am bound to say you would have passed this night in a cell. Luckily for you, Mr. Furneaux and I set our faces against the notion of your guilt from the beginning. Long before we saw you, we were keeping an eye on the real criminal. When you did appear, your conduct only confirmed our belief in your innocence. I told you why, you will remember, piped Furneaux. But Robert Fenley said no word. He was stunned. He began to feel ill again, and made for his rooms. Sylvia had not been seen since she heard of Mrs. Fenley's death. The detectives collected their belongings, which, with the gun and a bag packed with various articles taken from Hilton Fenley's suite, the reel, for instance, a suit of clothes bearing marks, possibly of moss, and the leather portfolio of papers, were entrusted to Farrow and another constable for safe conveyance. Accompanied by Trenholme, they walked to Easton. On the way, the artist supplied sufficient details of his 2 meetings with Sylvia to put them in possession of the main incidents. Furneaux, though suffering from a splitting headache, had recovered the use of a vinegary tongue. "I was mistaken in you," he chuckled. "You're a rank impressionist. Indeed, you're a neo-impressionist. Get busy and do it now, master of art. But she's a mighty nice girl, isn't she?" "Meaning Miss Manning?" said Trenholme coldly. "No, Eliza." "Sorry, I misunderstood." "Crénon, you've got it bad." "Got what bad?" "The matrimonial measles. You're sickening for them now. One of the worst symptoms in the man is his curt refusal to permit anybody else to admire one bright particular star of womanhood. If the girl hears another girl gushing over the young man, she's ready to scratch her eyes out. By Jove, it'll be many a day before you forget your visit to Roxton Park this morning, or yesterday morning, or whenever it was. I'm mixed. Life has been very strenuous during the past 15 hours. If you love me, James, put my poor head under a pump, or I'll be dreaming that our lightning sketch performer here, Long John Trenholme, late candidate for the P.R.A., but now devoted to the cult of Hymen, is going to marry Eliza of the White Horse, and that the fair Sylvia is pledged to cook us a dinner to-morrow night, or is it to-night? Oh, Gemini, how my head aches!" "Don't mind a word he's saying, Mr. Trenholme," put in Winter. "Hilton Fenley hit him a smack with that rifle, and it developed certain cracks already well marked. But he's a marvellously cute little codger, when you make due allowance for his peculiar ways. And he has a queer trick of guessing at future events with an accuracy which has surprised me more times than I can keep track of." Trenholme was too good a fellow not to put up with a little mild chaff of that sort. He looked at the horizon, where the faint streaks of another dawn were beginning to show in the northeast. "Please God," he said piously, "if I'm deemed worthy of such a boon, I'll marry Sylvia Manning or no other woman. And when the chance offers, Eliza of the White Horse shall cook you a dinner to make your mouth water. Thus will Mr. Furneaux's dream come true, because dreams go by contraries." End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Strange Case of Mortimer Fenley by Louis Tracy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Settlement. Winter tried to persuade his mercurial-spirited friend to snatch a few hours' rest. The police inspector obligingly offered a bed, but short of a positive order, which the superintendent did not care to give, nothing would induce Furneaux to let go his grip on the Fenley case. "Wait till the doctor's car comes back," he urged. "The chauffeur will carry the story a few pages farther. At any rate, we shall know where he dropped Fenley, and that is something." Winter produced a big cigar, and Trenholme felt his pockets for pipe and tobacco. "No, you don't, young man," said the big man firmly. "You're going straight to your room at the White Horse. And I'll tell you why. From what I have heard about the Fenleys, they were a lonely crowd. Their friends were business associates, and they seemed to own no relatives, while Miss Manning, if ever she possessed any, has been carefully shut away from them. The position of affairs in the Towers will be strained to-morrow. The elder Fenleys are dead. One son may be in jail, or if he isn't, might as well be, and the other, as soon as he feels his feet, will be giving himself airs. Now, haven't you a mother or an aunt who would come to Roxton and meet Miss Manning, and perhaps help her to get away from a house which is no fit place for her to live in at present?" "My mother can be here within an hour of the opening of the telegraph office," said Trenholme. "Write the telegram now, and the constable on night duty will attend to it. When your mother arrives, tell her the whole story, and send her to Miss Manning. Don't go yourself. You might meet Robert Fenley, and he would certainly be cantankerous. If your mother resembles you, she will have no difficulty in arranging matters with the young lady." "If I resemble my mother, I am a very fortunate man," said the artist simply. "I thought it would be that way," was the smiling comment. "One other thing. I don't suppose for a minute that Miss Manning is acquainted with a reputable firm of solicitors. If she is, tell her to consult them, and get them to communicate with Scotland Yard, where I shall supply, or leave with others, certain information which should be acted on promptly in her behalf. If, as I expect, she knows no lawyer, see that she takes this card to the address on it, and give Messrs. Gibb, Morris, and Gibb my message. You understand?" "Yes." "Finally, She must be warned to say nothing of this to Robert Fenley. In fact, the less that young spark knows about her affairs, the better. After tonight's adventure, that hint is hardly needed, perhaps, but it is always well to be explicit. Now, off with you. I'm not tired. Can I be of any service? Yes, I want you to be ready for a long day's work in Miss Manning's interests. Mr. Furneaux and I may be busy elsewhere. Unquestionably, we shall not be in Roxton. We may even be far from London. Miss Manning will want a friend. See to it that you start the day refreshed by some hours of sleep. Goodbye, said Trenholme promptly. Sorry you two will miss Eliza's dinner, but that is only a feast deferred. By the way, if I leave Roxton, I'll send you my address. Don't worry about that, smiled the superintendent. Our friend the inspector here will keep tabs on you. Before you're finished with inquests, police courts, and assizes, you'll wish you'd never heard the name of Fenley. By Jove, I nearly forgot to caution you. Not a word to the press. Phew, he whistled. If they get onto this story in its entirety, won't they publish chapter and verse? So Trenholme went out into the village street and walked to his quarters in the White Horse Inn. It was not yet 2:00, but dawn had already slivered the northeast arc of the horizon. Just 20 hours earlier, an alarm clock had waked him into such a day as few have experienced. Many a man has been brought unexpectedly into intimate touch with a tragedy of no personal concern, but seldom indeed do the fates contrive that death and love and high adventure should be so closely bound and packed pell-mell into one long day. Only to think of it, when he stole upstairs with the clock to play a trick on Eliza, he had never seen Sylvia, nor so much as heard her name spoken. When he sang of love and the dawn while striding homeward through the park, he had seen her, yet did not know her, and had no hope of ever seeing her again. When he worked at her picture, he had labored at the idealization of a dream which bade fair to remain a dream. And now, by some magic jugglery of ordinary events, each well within the bounds of credibility, yet so overwhelmingly incredible in their sequence and completeness, he was Sylvia's lover, her defender, her trusted knight-errant. Even the concluding words of that big, round-headed, sensible detective had brought a fantasy nearer attainment. If Sylvia were rich, why then a youngster who painted pictures for a living would hardly dare think of marrying her. But if Sylvia were poor, and Winter's comments seemed to show that these financiers had been financing themselves at her expense, what earthly reason was there that she should not become Mrs. John Trenholme at the earliest practicable date? None that he could conceive. Why, a fellow would have to be a fool indeed who did not know when he had met the one woman in the world. He had often laughed at other fellows who spoke in that way about the chosen one. Now he understood that they had been wise and he foolish. But suppose Sylvia— Oh, dash it, no need to spoil one's brief rest by allowing a beastly doubt like that to rear its ugly head. One thing he was sure of. Robert Fenley could never be a rival. And Fenley, churl that he was, had known her for years, and could hardly be pestering her with his attentions if she were pledged to another man. Moreover, he, John, newly in love, and tingling with the thrill of it, fancied that Sylvia would not have clung to him with such complete confidence when the uproar arose in the park, if... well, the history of the Fenley case will never be brought to an end if any attempt is made to analyze the effects of love's first vigorous growth in the artistic temperament. About 3:15, Dr. Stern's little landaulette was halted at the same crossroad where policemen had stopped it nearly 3 hours ago. "That you, Tom?" said the constable. "You're wanted at the station." "What station?" inquired the chauffeur. "The police station." "Am I, by gum? What's up?" "The Scotland Yard men want you." "But what for? I haven't run over so much as a hen." "Oh, it's all right. You're wanted as a witness. Never mind why. They'll tell you. The doctor is there, smoking a cigar till you turn up. I left him at Joe Bland's. Joe Bland has left Roxton for Kingdom Come, and the Towers is half burnt down. Things haven't been happening while you were away, have they?" "Not half," said Tom. "No, nor quarter," grinned the policeman to himself when the car moved on. "Wait till you know who you took on that trip, and why your sparkin' plug'll be out of order for a week." It was as well that the chauffeur had not the slightest notion that he had conveyed a murderer to London to his employer and the detectives. They wanted a plain, unvarnished story, and got it. On leaving the offices in Bishopsgate Street, Fenley had asked to be driven to Gloucester Mansions, Shaftesbury Avenue. Tom had seen the last of him standing on the pavement, with a suitcase on the ground at his feet. He was wearing an overcoat and a derby hat, and was pressing an electric bell. "He told me I needn't wait, so I made for the Edgware Road. That's all," said Tom. "Cool as a fish," commented Furneaux. "Well, sir, I didn't get hot over it," said the surprised chauffeur. "I am not talking about you. Could you manage another run to town? Are you too tired?" The mystified Tom looked at his employer. Dr. Stern laughed. "Go right ahead," he cried. "I'm thinking of buying a new car. 120 miles in one night should settle the matter, so far as this old rattletrap is concerned." "Of course we'll pay you, Doctor," said Winter. "That's more than Hilton Fenley will ever do, I'm afraid." Tom tickled his scalp under his cap. "Mr. Hilton, gimme a fiver," he said rather sheepishly. There was something going on that he did not understand, but he thought it advisable to own up with regard to that lordly tip. "You're a lucky fellow," said the doctor. "What about petrol? And do you feel able to take these gentlemen to London?" Tom was a wiry person. In 5 minutes he was on the road again, bound for Scotland Yard this time. As a matter of form, a detective was sent to Gloucester Mansions, and came back with the not unforeseen news that Mrs. Garth was very angry at being disturbed at such an unearthly hour. No, she had seen nothing of Mr. Hilton Fenley since the preceding afternoon. Someone had rung the bell about 2 o'clock that morning, but the summons was not repeated, and she had not inquired into it, thinking that a mistake had been made and discovered by the blunderer. Sheldon was brought from his residence. He had a very complete report concerning Mrs. Lyle, but that lady's shadowy form need not flit across the screen, since Robert Fenley's intrigues ceased to be of interest. He had dispatched her to France, urging that he must be given a free hand until the upset caused by his father's death was put straight. Suffice it to say that when he secured some few hundreds a year out of the residue of the estate, he married Mrs. Lyle, and possibly became a hen-pecked husband. The Garths, too, mother and daughter, may be dropped. There was no getting any restitution by them of any share of the proceeds of the robbery. They vowed they were innocent agents, and received no share of the plunder. Miss Eileen Garth had taken up musical comedy, if not seriously, at least zealously, and commenced in the chorus with quite a decent show of diamonds. London was scoured next morning for traces of Hilton Fenley, but with no result. This again fell in with anticipation. The brain that could plan the brutal murder of a father was not likely to fail when contriving its own safety. Somehow both Winter and Furneaux were convinced that Fenley would make for Paris, and that once there it would be difficult to lay hands on him. Furneaux, be it remembered, had gone very thoroughly into the bond robbery, and had reached certain conclusions when Mortimer Fenley stopped the inquiry. In pursuance of this notion, they resolved to watch the likeliest ports. Furneaux took Dover, Winter Newhaven, and Sheldon Folkestone. They did not even trouble to search the outgoing trains at the London termini, though a detailed description of the fugitive was circulated in the ordinary way. Each man travelled by the earliest train to his destination, and having secured the aid of the local police, mounted guard over the gangways. Furneaux drew the prize, which was only a just compensation for a sore head and sorer feelings. He had changed his clothing, but adopted no other disguise than a travelling cap pulled well down over his eyes. He took it for granted that Fenley, like every other intelligent person going abroad, was aware that all persons leaving the country are subjected to close, if unobtrusive, scrutiny as they step from pier to ship. Fenley, therefore, would have a sharp eye for the quietly dressed men who stand close to the steamer officials at the head of the gangway, but would hardly expect to find Nemesis hidden in the purser's cabin. Through a porthole, Furneaux saw every face, and on the third essay, while the fashionable crowd which elects to pay higher rates for the 11 o'clock express from Victoria was struggling, like less exalted people, to be on board quickly, he found his man in the thick of the press. Fenley had produced a new suit, a Homburg hat, and some baggage. In fact, it was learned afterwards that he hired a taxi at Charing Cross, breakfasted at Canterbury, and made his purchases there at leisure before driving on to Dover. He passed between two uniformed policemen with the utmost self-possession, even pausing there momentarily to give some instruction to a porter about the disposition of his portmanteau. That was a piece of pure bravado, perhaps a final test of his own highly strung nerves. The men, of course, were not watching him or any other individual in the hurrying throng. They had a sharp eye for Furneaux, however, and when he nodded and hurried from his lair, one of them grabbed Fenley by the shoulder. At that instant, a burly German, careless of anyone's comfort but his own, and somewhat irritated by Fenley's halt at the mouth of the gangway, brushed forward. His weight, and Fenley's quick flinching from that ominous clutch, loosed the policeman's hold, and the murderer was free once more for a few fleeting seconds. The constable pressed on, shoving the other man against the rail. "Here, I want you," he said, and the quietly spoken words rang in Fenley's ears as if they had been bellowed through a megaphone. Owing to his own delay, there was a clear space in front. He took that way of escape instinctively, though he knew he was doomed, since the ship's officers would seize him at the policeman's call. Then he saw Furneaux, whose foot was already on the lower end of the gangway. That, then, was the end. He was done for now. All that was left of life was the ghastly progress of the law's ceremonial, until he was brought to the scaffold and hanged amidst a whole nation's loathing. His eyes met Furneaux's in a glance of deadly malice. Then he looked into eternity with daring despair, and dived headlong over the railing into the sea. That awesome plunge created tremendous excitement among the bystanders on quay and ship. It was seen by hundreds. Men shouted, women screamed, not a few fainted. A sailor on the lower deck ran with a lifebelt, but Fenley never rose. His body was carried out by the tide, and was cast ashore some days later at the foot of Shakespeare's cliff. Then the poor mortal husk made some amendments for the misdeeds of a warped soul. In the pockets were found a large amount of negotiable scrip, and no small sum in notes and gold, with the result that Messrs. Gibb, Morris, and Gibb were enabled to recover the whole of Sylvia Manning's fortune, while the sale of the estate provided sufficiently for Robert Fenley's future. The course of true love never ran smoother than for John and Sylvia. They were so obviously made for each other, they had so determinedly flown to each other's arms, that it did not matter twopence to either whether Sylvia were rich or poor. But it mattered a great deal when they came to make plans for a glorious future. What a big, grand world it was, to be sure, and how much there was to see in it. The continent, America, the gorgeous East. They mapped out tours that would find them middle-aged before they neared England again. Does life consist, then, in flitting from hotel to hotel, from train to steamship? Not it. German Kultur took care to upset that theory. John Trenholme is now a war-worn major in the gunners, and Sylvia has only recently returned to her home nest after 4 years' service with the Red Cross in France. But these things came later. One evening in the autumn, Winter and Furneaux took Sheldon over to Roxton, and dined with Dr. Stern and Tomlinson at the White Horse. Tomlinson had bought the White Horse, and secured Eliza with the fixtures. Of course, there was talk of the Fenleys, and Winter told how Hilton Fenley's mother had been unearthed in Paris. She was a spiteful and wizened half-caste, but she held her son dear, as mothers will, be they black or white or chocolate-coloured, and it was to maintain her in an establishment of some style that he had begun to steal. She had married again, and the man had gone through all her money, dying when there was none left. She retained his name, however, and Fenley adopted it too during frequent visits to Paris. Hence he was known there by a good many people, and could have sunk his own personality had he made good his escape. The mother's hatred of Mortimer Fenley had probably communicated itself to her son. When she was told of Hilton's suicide and its cause, she said that if anything could console her for his death, it was the fact that he had avenged her wrongs on his father. "What was her grievance against poor Mortimer Fenley?" inquired the doctor. "I knew him well, and he was a decent sort of fellow, rather blustering and dictatorial, but not bad-hearted." "His success, I believe," said Winter. "They disagreed, and she divorced him, thinking he would remain poor. The whirligig of time changed their relative positions, and to a jealous-minded woman that was unforgivable." "The affair made a rare stir here, anyhow," went on the doctor. The people who have taken the towers have not only changed the name of the place, but they have commissioned a friend of mine, an architect, to alter the entrance. There will be 2 flights of steps and a covered porch, so the exact spot where Fenley fell dead will be built over. "Gentlemen," said Tomlinson, "talking is dry work. I haven't my old cellar to select from, but I can recommend the brands you see on the table. Mr. Furneaux, I'm sure you have not forgotten that Chateau Yquem?" Then, and not until then, did the ex-butler hear that the detectives had never tasted his famous port. His benign features were wrung with pain, for it was a wine of a rare bouquet, and hard to replace. But Furneaux restored his wonted geniality by opening a parcel hitherto reposing on the sideboard. "I never sent you that bottle of Alto d'Oro," he cried. "Here it is, a crusted quart for your own drinking. Lest you should be tempted to be too generous tonight, I've brought another. Now, a cradle and a corkscrew." So, after a dirge, and before the world shook in war, the story ends on a lively note, for what is there to compare with good wine and good cheer, each in moderation? And 1 bottle among 5 is reasonable enough in all conscience. End of chapter 17. End of The Strange Case of Mortimer Fenley by Louis Tracy. Recording by Kirsten Wever.